Hi there, I'm Richard Denning and I'm the author of this book, The Amber Treasure, which is the first of a series of Dark Age historical fiction set in 6th and 7th century Northumbria. In this excerpt, Cerdic, who is the 17-year-old hero of the book, has been spending most of his childhood dreaming of the glories of battle, but is about to find that the reality is somewhat more terrifying. He has spent the last night of his childhood out hunting wild pigs with his friends and all the other companions who have been training for the fjord with him, and they come back one morning to find that the village is on fire, and the three of them are running into the village to try and find out what happens. They find that it has been raided from nearby Elmet, Romano-British or Welsh Kingdom of Elmet, and that the raiders are trying to take away most of the villagers into slavery. Cerdic realises that he and his two companions must act. They can't wait for the rest of the fjord to arrive, and this is what happens next. The three Welsh warriors all looked alarmingly strong. The lead fellow's arms carried scars that spoke of many battles. The other two were younger, but looked just as confident. Our only hope here was surprise. If the raiders had come from the west, they must have missed us as we hunted our wild pigs in the woods. As such, they would not expect an attack from that direction. I indicated to my friends to follow me, and then ran south a little way to where the grass in the meadow was long. I then crouched down. The others did likewise. I pointed at Cuthbert's bow, and then at the lead warrior. I then held up my fore and middle fingers. I wanted 2 arrows fired at him. Cuthbert gulped hard, his lips twitching. But he nodded, and then pulled the bow from his shoulder, strung it, and took the 3 arrows he had thrust through his belt. These he stabbed into the ground in front of him so as to be ready for use. He took one and loaded it onto the bowstring. I held my hand up to tell him to hold fire a moment, and he pointed the bow down to the ground. I now drew out my long sea-axe. It was a gift from my grandfather when I was just 4, and although father had not let me carry it until I was 8. I had no sword, but this was sharp and broad and would have to do. Edward was not armed, and I was worried about that. Indeed, I was worried about the whole situation. We were just 3 17-year-old boys. Our village's strongest men had been killed. How could we hope to defeat even 3 experienced warriors, the youngest of whom must be 5 years our elder? Edward seemed to sense my hesitation. He made a fist and punched it against his other palm. Clearly he was ready. The warriors and their miserable booty were now quite close. They were moving more southerly now. I looked around and saw that the grass behind me was trodden down. So the Welsh had come up from the Humber. They must have followed it from Elmet before striking north and east to the village. I whispered to Cuthbert, "Now." My friend nodded and then rose out of the grass. He brought his left arm up and locked the elbow, then drew back on the string. He aimed the arrowhead at the lead warrior, who was now only 30 paces away. Cuthbert held his breath for an instant, then let the arrow fly. There was a look of startled horror on the face of his target, and then a sickening sound as the missile punctured into his chest. He gave a brief cry of pain, then fell forward onto his knees. For a moment I didn't move. Despite the years of training for war, this was the first time I had seen a man actually hit by bow or blade. Then to my right Edward burst up from the grass and charged straight for the second guard. I recovered my senses as Cuthbert's second arrow left his bow and flew towards the wounded foe. It hit him in his throat, and the man's hand flew up to grasp the arrow, shock and disbelief showing in his wide eyes. Then he tumbled full length onto the grass, already dead. I ran forward 10 yards behind Edward, feeling the blood pumping through my veins, and my heart pounding like a blacksmith's hammer. Suddenly the fear was gone, and all I now wanted was to kill these bastards and make them pay for what they had done to us. The women and children started screaming and crouched down in the grass, shielding their heads with their arms. As yet they didn't recognise us. And why should they? We were bellowing and screaming in fury, faces distorted with rage and vengeance, hardly the friendly lads they knew from around the village. The second guard, a man of maybe 20 summers, looked more puzzled than surprised, as if he could not quite understand what was happening. Edward was 5 yards from him when the warrior finally spotted him and quickly tried to bring his spear point to bear. He had been walking along with the shaft leaning casually against his right shoulder, and it took him a few moments to swing it down to point it at Edward. Moments later, Edward arrived in front of him, running so fast that he could not slow down in time. Had he arrived a heartbeat later, he would have taken the point firmly in the chest, and his own weight would have impaled him upon it. Fate and the Valkyries must have been watching him that day, for the point was angled still slightly up, so, although it hit him, it was deflected off his shoulder, piercing muscle and ripping a gash right up to his neck. He gave an agonising cry at the pain, but then ploughed headlong into the warrior. They both tumbled over and landed heavily on the ground, which knocked the wind out of them, the guard ending up underneath my friend. I now arrived at the floundering pair, knife in hand. The Welsh lad was looking up at me, eyes showing the fear he must now feel. Realising that I must thrust my blade into him, my rage dispersed, and all I could feel was the bile raising into my throat. I knew I had to do this thing. Think of Edith, think of Edward, I told myself, and I moved towards the enemy. Fate now took a hand and spared me the choice, for at that moment the third Welsh warrior bellowed, a war cry full of hate. He was a dozen yards away, following the line of villagers. I could see that he was some 25 years old and had the same dark black hair as the other two. Indeed, there was a shape to the face and a look in his eyes that was similar to the older warrior whom Cuthbert had shot. The thought occurred to me that these three might all be brothers. I had no time to debate such matters. He was already moving towards me. He had dropped his spear and drawn a sword whose blade gleamed and shone red under the sunset light. He swung it from side to side as he closed upon me, a man set on revenge for a dead brother. He was close now, just 5 yards away. I glanced down at my short knife and sighed. So it would end here. I would be just one more youth slain this day. After all, he was a strong and fierce warrior. I was just a boy who only yesterday was practising with wicker shields on the last spring afternoon of my childhood. I should run, I thought, get away, survive, but I could not. Whether I was frozen in terror or held by some feeling of honour and duty, I cannot recall. I tried to think of some ferocious battle cry or threat to intimidate him, but it was already too late. He moved in and swung back his blade to cut down on my shoulder. I moved my knife up to block the blow, realising as I did that he would knock it aside with ease. Then I heard a buzzing sound past my right ear. An instant later I could see an arrow embedded in the warrior's left arm. He gave a cry of pain, moved his right hand across as a reflex and dropped the sword. In a flash I was on him. I thrust the knife hard into his upper abdomen, beneath his ribs, and felt it ram home. Blood gushed out of the wound and ran hotly down my arm, drenching my tunic. He stared at me in horror, grabbed my shoulder with his hands and pulled me towards him. Even with a knife in his gut, the strength he had was surprising. But it began to drain away, just as his lifeblood ran down me. Finally, his hands released me, and he slumped down, first onto his knees, and then, with a groan, onto his front. Turning round, I could see that Edward was still punching the other warrior with his good arm. The Welshman's head hit the ground with the sound of splintering bone that told me he had hit a rock or stone, and now lay completely still, perhaps dead, perhaps knocked out. Edward, holding a hand over his still bleeding wound, slumped down next to his enemy. Then he looked at me for a moment, eyes unfocused at first. He blinked and, dragging himself over, collapsed on the ground beside me. We glanced over at Cuthbert. He was still crouching in the grass, bow in his left hand, staring open-mouthed at what he had just seen. Then suddenly he laughed. "I wonder what old Grettir will say about this," he said. And there we go. That's the first battle by Cuthbert and his two companions, and it is the start of his experience of war in the climactic times that form the British Isles as we know today. The times when things gone a different way. There may not have been in England or Wales or Scotland. There may not have been the nations and the languages that we know about today. These are the darkest years, the Dark Ages. And my Northern Crown series, the Amber Treasure being the first of, which will take you through many of those climactic times. I hope you check it out.